Let's take a look at some of the differences between our basic material editor and our advanced material editor. I'm going to load in just a standard terrain right now. We're going to double click on this terrain and our material preview, and that's going to open up our material editor. Now we have the basic material editor, which we can see right now. If we click on advanced, we're going to open up our advanced material editor. There's a lot of large differences between these two. Majorly, we can notice that we have a lot more options within the advanced material editor. But overall, the basic material editor is really for very quick texture map editing. If we take a look at this material, and if I go ahead and click on our color map, and if we click to load, it's basically going to ask us to load in a texture map. So if we go ahead and click on that, we can select any of the texture maps that we have already loaded in. I'm just going to grab our checker weave again, and now we have just our color map, which is automatic mapping directly on this terrain, and we can see that showing up. For our bump map, we can select to turn on our bump map and either load in a separate image, or we can have a direct link to our color map by selecting Use Color Map, which will just copy that over. And in some cases, your color map will work as a bump map, but not in every case. So sometimes you will need separate materials for that. And then we also have the ability to use an alpha map. And in this case, we can also use our color map. Now with all of these options turned on, where we're just using one map, that checker weave map that we used in the mapping chapter, we can see that we have our bump showing up, along with our color, and then our alpha map is also being used from this same map because there are white areas, and that way we can have some transparency. So we can see the overall effect of this material. If I click in our preview, we can see now this material is showing up. And we have access to some of the major settings where we have a reflection amount. We can turn that on, and now we're starting to reflect the sky and the scene around it. We also have our highlight intensity and the overall specular effect on this object, and now we can see that showing up without any reflection. We can rotate around our camera to see that a little bit better. And our transparency we have as well, but since we have an alpha map connected, this transparency option is not going to work. So if we turn off our alpha map and we take a look in the preview at our just current texture, we can increase our transparency based on that percentage value, which is going to give us an overall transparency rather than something that we have connected to an alpha map, where we have either it is transparent or it isn't. And the way this alpha map works is white being the most transparent, or 100%, and black being 0% transparent and no transparency whatsoever. We can also adjust the scale of our maps. We can see down here, so I could change this to 0.5 on our X and our Y, and now we're going to notice a lot more of that checker pattern on our terrain. We can also change our mapping modes from all of the other options that we have, and this is global throughout the advanced and the basic material editor, where all of these options are available. If we go up to the top, we can also see that we have a mixed material option. So now we have the first material that we had created. We can see that showing up along with our second material. But this is all mainly texture-based and based on image maps, and not so much what we're actually creating within View with the function editor and things like that. There really aren't a lot of options available, but sometimes it can be a very quick and easy way to modify specific objects. So I'm going to just hit X, and we're going to close that out. I'm going to delete our terrain, and let's just load in a plant. We'll just right mouse click on our plant icon, and we're going to load in just the plum tree. And one of the things about trees is that they are mainly image-based, at least their leaves are, not so much the actual bark. So if we take a look at our image now, and we can select between each of our materials that are on this object, and if we also right mouse click, we can see that we have the plum tree trunk and the plum leaves. So now we're in our leaves preset. We can double click and that'll open up our basic material editor since that's the last thing we had opened. And now we can see the overall tree. So this is a really quick way to modify trees because these are image based. So we could just load in another set of images for our leaves and our alpha maps, and also set our bump map if we wanted to. We can see that we have a bump gain setting, which will allow us to adjust the overall bump effect and how much depth we are actually simulating. But beyond that, there's really not much we can do. If we switch over to the Advanced Material Editor, now we can see everything that is creating this material a little bit better, along with a lot of other options that we have to modify this. If we take a look at the top, we can already see that we have two new options under Type, where we have the ability to create a volumetric material and an ecosystem. And we're not going to be covering ecosystems in this tutorial. And that's mainly because there's so much that make up an ecosystem material. But if you want to learn about that, you can just check out Advanced Ecosystem Creation, another tutorial we've created, where we fully go in depth on how to work with specific ecosystems. Under Effects, we also notice a bunch of new options. We can select one-sided, cast shadows, anti-aliased, receive shadows, indirect lighting, and only shadows. And these options are fairly straightforward, but I can show some examples to explain them a little bit better. And to do that, I'm going to be using a different material, or a different object. I'll go ahead and just click on that tree and delete it. And I'm going to load in just a plane, and we can see that show up. I'm also going to load in a specific surface for this, so that way it's not just the default, and we can see a little bit of separation from the ground plane. And I could just go to Basic, and I'm going to select our blue plastic and click OK. So now we can see this plane showing up. We can take a look at it. And let's take a look at some of those options in the Advanced Material Editor. The first thing we'll notice is we have a one-sided. If we take a look underneath this material, we're really not going to notice any change. If we go back up, let that render, overall it looks basically the same. And that's because this one-sided effect is really going to show up more in transparent object. And since we have a plane that's really basically just a polygon, there's really not a whole lot we can see that. This will become more useful with some of our other settings, so I'm going to load in just one of our spheres. We'll be able to see this a little bit better. So we want to go back into the Advanced Material Editor, now with our sphere on, and using that blue plastic material since we use that to apply to our plane. And we're creating new objects, and it will automatically apply the previous material to the new object we've created. I'm just going to turn off one-sided for right now, and we're going to go to our Transparency tab. And under Global Transparency, we're just going to increase this amount. And we can take a look at the render that is showing up for our main camera. And the one thing we can notice in our preview render is that we have two sets of specularity. We have our main specularity on the outside, but we also have a little bit of specularity where we see a little bit of a flare on the inside. And what that actually is we're seeing the inside of our sphere with a light penetrating through it. Now, because one-sided is turned off, we're currently seeing both sides of our sphere, where we're seeing the back of it along with the outside. And really, because transparency is on, we can see that. If transparency was off, we're not going to notice that at all, because we're really only seeing the outside section of our sphere anyway, which is basically just one side. If I turn on one-sided now, it basically looks the same. We can still see both of our specular objects, but that's because our overall transparency is active, and we really don't have any options that are removing specific areas. If we turn on fuzzy for our effects, and right now it's currently set to solid, let's go ahead and increase that. Now we can see with fuzziness on, and no matter how much we increase this, if we notice up at the top, we can see one-sided is automatically active. Because with an object with a bit of fuzziness, we really want to focus more on one side than the other, and it is automatically forced to use one-sided. So we don't see that specularity on both sides of our object because it's automatically going to one-sided. Turn off fuzziness, and we take a look at our render. And now because we switched that over to fuzzy, our fading out has been altered, so we can adjust our fading out amount and how murky our surface is. Turn that back to one-sided, go back, and as we adjust our fading out, we can see that altered slightly, really depending on the material. But it's mainly an option that we have there for transparent surfaces only. So if you're not working with a transparent surface, don't worry about it at all. If you are, and you're getting some results you maybe don't like, try checking that on and off, take a look at some of the different settings, and see if you'll be able to correct any mistakes you may be having. But that option is there for our transparent surfaces. And basically what it does overall is it just allows one intersection per ray, and basically just how the light is affecting our object. Most of the time you just want to keep that turned off. If we go ahead and turn that off right now, we can see an entirely different object. Turn that back on, take a look, and now we can see a bit of a change. So switching back and forth between these can give you a lot of different results depending on some of the other settings you have available for your different transparency. And there's a lot of different things we have available for adjusting our transparency, mainly fading out, fuzziness, and our variable transparency, along with our alpha as well. So I'm just going to click OK. We're going to delete our sphere, go back to our plane, and now we're going to select our plane and double-click to bring into our Advanced Material Editor. The next setting we have is our cast shadows. And if we take a look at our object, we can see shadows showing up in our scene from this material. But if we turn off cast shadows, now the shadow is completely removed, and we don't have this specific material casting any shadows anywhere in our scene. So that can be very helpful if you've created an object that you want to receive the light from the scene and receive shadows from other objects, but you don't want it to cast its own shadows. And that can also help you for isolating specific textures as well. The next setting we have underneath one-sided is Anti-Aliased. Now this is for directly on specific types of materials, and it gives us the option to anti-alias our materials, which is a rendering option. And if you're not familiar with anti-aliasing, it's basically a way to remove pixelation and bits of graininess within certain materials. And sometimes having anti-aliased surface will be helpful, but sometimes it won't be, and you really don't need to have that setting on. And this global anti-aliasing is actually within our render options. So if we go up to the top with our camera, we can right mouse click and see our render options. Now in order to really adjust these settings, we can see we have an anti-aliasing setting where we have object and texture anti-aliasing. And the direct connection is going to be with our texture anti-aliasing. So if we set this to a user setting, this will give us the ability to adjust each one of these. So we can turn on texture anti-aliasing, which is mainly going to affect texture maps. If we go to edit, we have a whole bunch of different options in here for adjusting our anti-aliasing, how many rays and how many times we're going to be re-rendering those specific areas in order to get them to the correct quality. The higher the settings are for anti-aliasing, the better your quality you're going to get out of your render, but the longer it is going to take to render specific options. So those settings are there, and you can choose to use your anti-aliasing settings just by turning them on and off, and you'll really get different results depending on which sort of material you use. So if you have a material that's very grainy and you'd like it to keep it somewhat grainy, then you might want to turn off anti-aliasing for that material. By default, that setting is on, and in most cases you're going to want to leave that on. If we take a look at our next option, it is receive shadows. In order to really show this, we're going to need to create another object for our scene. So this time I'll just create a sphere, and we'll move it off to the side so that we can see its shadow on our plane. And we can see how that's just casting a shadow along the side here. If we take a look at the material preview, or main camera preview, we can see that really showing up. If we go back into the advanced material editor, and we want to make sure actually we're doing this for our plane and not our sphere, we're going to select and turn off receive shadows. So now as this updates, we no longer see that shadow from this surface directly on our material. And we can still see it on the ground plane, but that's because our sphere is still casting shadows. It's just this specific material is not receiving them. So no matter how many objects in the scene or how many shadows we have being cast, this object will no longer receive shadows from anything. And that also includes our skies. So if you have cloud layers with shadows, with that option off, you won't see those clouds showing up on that surface. And our next option is our indirect lighting. Now by default, all of our materials have indirect lighting checked. If I go ahead and turn that off and we take a look at our surface, we can see that it's brightened up quite a bit. And that's because indirect lighting is a much more realistic way of rendering, where we're using our lights from sort of a global method where we're taking into account the atmosphere and other objects around it. And if it is checked off, we're using a direct light, which these settings are going to show up a lot differently, and we're going to get an entirely different result. For the most realistic surfaces, you're going to want to keep indirect lighting on, and that way we're using our atmosphere to light this along with the rest of our scene and not just the specific light. Because with direct lighting, when we have it checked off, we're using specifically our sunlight in this case, because it's the only light in our scene, to light this specific material and light the object. And because of that, we're going to end up with a much brighter looking object. Of course, that really depends on the intensity settings of your light, but overall you get a much more realistic result with indirect lighting. So if you have a material that you want direct lighting to be used on, you can turn this on and off for all of your different materials. And you'll receive different types of effects depending on the type of material you're using and the overall lighting in the scene. Sometimes it will be necessary to turn it off if you wish to use that direct lighting, but typically you'll want to have that set to an indirect lighting for the most realistic look. Our last option, which is about as straightforward as the other ones, is our only shadows. And if I turn that on right now and we take a look at our scene, we can see that the object has disappeared, and of course we can still see the shadow. So this is a great way to just create specific shadows in your scene without actually having the actual material and the actual object show up. And if I click OK and we go to our Sphere 2, we could turn on only shadows for that as well. So now we just have these shadows being created directly on our scene. And this is a great way for faking shadows. And of course right now we see very sharp shadows, but if we were to use more softened edges and a softer shadow, then it's going to look a little bit better. And we can see, if I click on our sunlight, we go up to the top, we can see we have a softness option. So I could increase our softness. And now this render isn't going to turn out that great in our preview, but we can see how we can create some nice soft shadows just by using objects, but not actually have them show up in the scene, because now we're just creating just a shadow and nothing else. So that's a really nice feature that's available.